in and around this courtroom. I wanted to greet you very quickly, but I needed some patience. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is case number IT0369T, the prosecutor versus Stanišić and Simatović.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar. Mr. Bakac, are you ready to continue your closing argument?
Yes, Časni sud.
Yes, Your Honor, indeed. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone in and around the courtroom, yet again. I would just like very briefly to recall, since we did have a brief interruption yesterday, that before the interruption, before the adjournment yesterday, we dealt with the evidence that the prosecution led in order to prove Simatović's contribution to the implementation of the alleged JCE in Krajina. We have addressed the trial chamber and we have indicated that there are some exhibits that strongly contradict the prosecution's allegations. We dealt with this in part in closed session. Now I would like to say something about testimony of a protected prosecution witness, and therefore I would like the trial chamber to order the court to go into private session.
We move into private session. Your microphone is open, Mr. Bakac.
Your Honors, we're in open session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bakac.
Hvala, Časni sudi.
Thank you, Your Honors. I do apologize. The prosecution has drawn the trial chamber's attention to the fact that the Simatović defense devoted many pages to analyzing the relationship between Captain Dragan and Franko Simatović, and it appears to us that the prosecution implies that the defense had decided to set aside the Exhibit P3251 on purpose. The defense would like to thank the prosecution for mentioning this document because we are convinced that this document in fact corroborates the defense case. This is a textbook example of an intelligence document. At page 2, penultimate paragraph, Simatović, as an operative of the Belgrade Center of the State Security Service, you can see that from the heading, notes down the following words. In the course of the interview, we have tried to provoke him, meaning Daniel Snedden, into talking about any knowledge he might have about weapons transports through Bosnia, but he displayed no interest, refusing to discuss the topic. It is quite obvious that this is an interview between an operative and the person they were investigating. It is an attempt to use an operative method to obtain information. It is quite apparent that between the operative and the subject there is a complete lack of trust. If it is true that as early as in April 1991, at the time of that interview, Simatović and Daniel Snedden were already in close contact, if it's true that at the time Snedden was part of the plan to use him as an instructor, as a trainer for the Serb forces in the Knin Krajina area, then every reasonable trier of fact must conclude that either the plan does not exist or that Simatović is unaware of it. This document confirms the defense case that Franko Simatović was involved in the effort to detect the activities of foreign intelligence services, and this includes the case of Daniel Snedden, as the defense has been claiming throughout the proceedings. Simatović's job at the time as the member of the US section in the DB Center in Belgrade is displayed in the following note. In the same document, Simatović says, "We believe that this case should be treated with utmost caution, since all the facts indicate that Snedden has ties with the agglomerate of the Israeli, German, English and American intelligence services." This conclusion is further corroborated by the last paragraph in this document, quoted by the prosecution, where it says, "Virtually all the contacts established by Daniel Snedden may be of interest both for foreign intelligence services and for our own service. His access to the Serbian Assembly and the ministries is of particular importance." And finally, Simatović makes a proposal saying that Snedden should be brought in and interrogated about all the elements of his activities in the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia and his links with the foreign services, and then assess the purpose and objective of further operational contacts with him. In the very last sentence, Simatović says that the second administration and the leadership of the SDB of the Serbian Republican SUP should be consulted. So this clearly shows that in April, and this is the time when prosecution contends the JCE began, Franko Simatović is going about his business in the intelligence service, proposing measures that include even bringing Snedden into custody. So Franko Simatović is not the person who should arrest people. He should merely, it was his task to submit reports about all the measures, operational measures that he had taken. The defense would also like to note that the prosecution's brief and final brief and closing arguments do not show clearly whether it is their case that Simatović's participation in the JCE began in August 1990 with his alleged involvement in Krajina, or whether his participation begins in April 1991 after the JCE has already been designed and set in motion. Regardless of which of the two arguments the prosecution intends to pursue, the document clearly shows that by mid-April 1991, Franko Simatović is neither aware of the alleged JCE, nor is he a participant. In the oral closing arguments, the prosecution highlighted a paragraph from Exhibit P2976, where it is a part of a video recording where Captain Dragan discusses his relationship with Franko Simatović. Captain Dragan is obviously talking about this contact in April 1991 that we have already dealt with just now. The prosecution considers this evidence to be proof of contacts between Captain Dragan and Simatović, but the prosecution would also like to suggest to the trial chamber that at the time Captain Dragan and Simatović were already friends. However, it is very important to read what the Exhibit P2976 actually says. In the interview, Captain Dragan says, "At that time, I became sort of friends with Franko Simatović." So when he says, "I became sort of friends with Franko Simatović," he is not talking about real friendship. He's talking about a relationship that can be interpreted in any number of ways. The defense would like to imply that perhaps because of the nature of this relationship, where Captain Dragan had come to realize that he was under surveillance, that he actually said this ironically. to corroborate the reasonable argument of the defense, we can quote what Captain Dragan said at the previous page of the same exhibit, where he comments on the role Jovica Stanišić and Franko Simatović played in Knin in the spring of 1991. Captain Dragan says the following, so it is on the previous page. And he is quite adamant about it. Frankie is an intelligence agent. In that period, that segment of the service was involved in getting information from the field. Does this quote by Captain Dragan differ in any way from the defense case that has been presented in detail in its final brief? In this case, yet again, the prosecution sets aside the totality of the evidence on record and goes on to interpret the evidence piecemeal, quoting selectively, splitting the evidence artificially, and using only those elements that they believe can corroborate their case. Particularly striking is the prosecution's bid to describe the relationship between Captain Dragan and the accused as very friendly on the basis of the purported warm hug between them at the award ceremony in Kula in 1997. I will say just this. The purported warm hug in 1997 does not say anything about the relationship between Simatović and Captain Dragan in 1991 or indeed in 1992 or at any point in time later. This hug may have been a sign of courtesy, it may have been dishonest, it may have been the result of a friendship that occurred or happened after 1996. So this hug does not tell us anything, and we don't think that it can tell anything to the trial chamber or be of any assistance. In its final brief, the prosecution analyzed the participation and activities of Franko Simatović in the events in Lovinac in 1991. In the brief, the prosecution is trying to establish a link between Simatović and the events in Lovinac. That's in paragraphs 402 through 405. Well, first of all, Lovinac is in the immediate vicinity of a large JNA depot in Sveti Rok that had been blocked, and the JNA was trying to deblock it. In the end, it deployed a very strong force and finally managed to do that. And in the course of that action, JNA took Lovinac as described in detail in our final brief in paragraphs 223 through 226. The prosecution, however, is trying to depict the events of the 26th of September 1991 based on D1473 to establish a link with Simatović. At that time, he had not been in Knin for 2 months. The central source for this claim is Babić. The prosecution relies on Babić's evidence about what Babić heard in Lovinac in September 1991, or rather after the events in Lovinac, what he heard in a restaurant at the Knin fort. Babić testifies that he heard Simatović boast of his participation in the event in Lovinac. That's Exhibit P, 1877, page 44. Witness JF039 also testifies about Lovinac, but in a completely different context. Babić figures here as the source of the claims, allegations about Simatović, as the key and central source that prosecution is relying on. In addition to the fact that Babić's testimony is inconsistent, but it is also quite vague when it comes to Simatović. At the time when Babić testified, none of the participants was interested in Simatović at all. Nobody tried to explain what Babić knew and what he had to say about Simatović's role quite specifically, especially if we bear in mind that Babić's description of the events in Lovinac is contradicted by Mladić's entries as to who took Lovinac, what forces were used, and what the consequences were of the capture of Lovinac. And Babić's claims cannot be used to draw any conclusions about Simatović's role in these events. In the previous proceedings, no one asked Babić what he was basing his claims on regarding Simatović and his acts or omissions, because, to put it quite simply, the participants in those proceedings were not interested. The prosecution fails to state how many attacks there were on Lovinac. In the case file, we have evidence indicating that there was fighting around Lovinac on at least 3 occasions: in early August 1991, in early September 1991, as evidenced by Exhibit P 1123, and in late September 1991, as shown by D 1473. It is quite obvious that on the 16th of September 1991, as evidenced by Exhibit P 1123, Lovinac was held by the Croatian forces. All Babić's claims that Lovinac had been taken before that date, that it had been torched and looted, are simply contradicted by P 1123. All claims made by JF 039 that the armored train was used to intimidate the population and make them leave the area are likewise unfounded, because the people remained in Lovinac until the 26th of September 1991, until the attack on the JNA Colonel Trbović. So at the time when Franko Simatović had already been out of Krajina for a month, the Croatian population in Lovinac still remained there. Now, was anyone killed in early August in Lovinac? Did anyone leave Lovinac at that time? Were any buildings damaged on that occasion? There is simply no evidence about that in this case. The defense would also like to highlight the issue of the armored train and how it can be linked with Simatović. The prosecution makes several references to P2673, a document that is patently unauthentic. It is quite obvious that this is the case because it bears a stamp with the Croatian checkerboard emblem. It is hard to imagine that a document that was purportedly created in Knin in June 1991 would bear such a stamp with the Croatian checkerboard. The trial chamber has heard evidence that one of the key causes of the unrest that erupted in Knin in the summer of 1990 was precisely the problem of the new symbols in use in Croatia, including the checkerboard. The text of the document, the dialect, the syntax, clearly show that the document has nothing to do with Franko Simatović and that he cannot be the author.
Tužilac spočitava Franku Simatoviću.
The prosecution alleges that Franko Simatović played an important role in the events in Glina. In the context of the crimes in SAO Krajina, the prosecution mentions the so-called early attacks, including the attack on Glina. In paragraph 401, the prosecution uses these arguments to show that as early as in the summer of 1991, there were attacks on the civilian population as a sort of an introduction to the events that are alleged to have happened. The prosecution quotes P2873, where it says that about 30 houses had been destroyed. However, the same exhibit goes on to say in the very next sentence that the houses were strongly fortified and that casualties were caused because fire was opened from those houses. Exhibits P2873 and P2875 clearly indicate that fire was opened on those houses in order to neutralize legitimate military targets. The prosecution uses P2875 to prove that this was an attack on civilian buildings, but in the very same exhibit, the author states that fire was opened at him from this civilian building. The prosecution uses only parts of documents, or in some cases just some parts of sentences in the documents, and the rest of the sentence that is left out by the prosecution paint a completely different picture of the events. The evidence that is quoted by the prosecution regarding the events in Glina cannot serve as any kind of evidence and for any kind of conclusions about the crimes that allegedly happened as early as in July 1991. And as alleged elsewhere in the prosecution brief, they should have let the accused know what he could expect from the units he was associated with. You can see that in paragraph 747 of the final brief of the prosecution. The defense would like to address an event that occurred at the end of 1991. Simatović was not in Krajina at the time, but we like to use it to illustrate how far the prosecution is ready to go in its efforts to establish the link between Simatović and the crimes and events that have nothing to do with him. Lacking relevant and credible evidence, the prosecution is trying to use each and every detail to establish this link between Simatović and the events on the ground. Another striking example is contained in paragraph 422 of the prosecution brief, where the prosecution states that Nikola Medaković commanded the unit of the Martić's police that attacked Saborsko, and that Medaković trained in Golubić, where he saw Simatović as he trained there. Witness Bosnić's statement is quoted in paragraph 72 of his statement, that's exhibit D313. He says he never met Simatović, that he heard from Medaković that this man showed up in Golubić, that he showed up only once, and that he was not involved in the training. What Medaković told Bosnić, that he saw a man once and that he was told this was Frankie, and the fact that Medaković took part in the attack on Saborsko several months after that conversation should serve to establish some kind of a link between Simatović and Saborsko. The defense considers that the manner in which the prosecution has gone about establishing the link does not lend itself to any conclusions whatsoever. The prosecution alleges that a person saw Simatović at one point, and that this can be used to prove that Simatović has anything to do with Saborsko and the events there. To prove Medaković's participation, prosecution relies on P2628, ignoring the contents of that exhibit, which gives us the full picture of who is attacking Saborsko and how. In paragraph 426, the prosecution states that Medaković, who saw Simatović once in Golubić many months before, that he read out the order for the attack. However, yet again, the prosecution is citing only a part of the sentence. It is true that Medaković read out the order, but Medaković did not read his own order. It was an order issued by the JNA General Bulat, who commanded the attack on Saborsko, and this is all contained at page 4 of the exhibit P2628. The exhibit also states that the JNA aircrafts took part in the attack, and that the JNA artillery from the Slunj training area also took part. Simatović has nothing to do. There are no direct or indirect links between Simatović and the attack on Saborsko. It is clear from the evidence that the defense relies on in its brief in paragraphs 117 through 133, and it is also clear from the evidence quoted by the prosecution if we look at them in their entirety. We used Saborsko as a striking example of a situation where Simatović is not physically present in Krajina, yet an effort is made to establish a link between him and the crimes that have nothing to do with him at all. Can we establish this link in this manner? Medaković took part in the attack on Saborsko. Months before that, he saw Simatović in Golubić. Does this establish the link? Does this prove Simatović's responsibility for the crimes? The key witnesses and exhibits invoked by the prosecution in its brief do not give us any idea and do not constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt of the way in which Simatović may have aided at all, let alone how he may have aided the implementation of the JCE in SAO Krajina. We would like to draw the attention of the trial chamber to the parts of our brief that pertain to Franko Simatović's departure, stay, and return from Knin Krajina. When the defense's evidence is compared with the evidence led by the prosecution, it becomes clear that the prosecution has failed to prove the facts in issue regarding the events in SAO Krajina.
Doduše ne u svom usmenom obraćanju, ali u svom
In its written brief, the prosecution spoke about the implementation of the JCE in Eastern Slavonia and the contribution of Franko Simatović to that JCE. The defense will just very briefly address some of the allegations made by the prosecution regarding Simatović's role and the role of the units that are associated with him in Eastern Slavonia, Baranja and Western Srem.
u svom završnom podnesku paragraf
In their final brief, paragraphs 74 and 696, the prosecution alleges that before the fall of Vukovar in 1991, Simatović came to the meeting at the command of the Guards Brigade, and that he also attended a ceremony to celebrate the event after the fall of Vukovar. The sole and principal evidence they rely on for this claim is the testimony of JF 033. And now, Your Honours, I would like us to go into private session, please.
We move into private session.
Your Honours, we are back in open session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar.
Hvala časni sud, izvinjavam.
Thank you, Your Honours. I apologize if I was a bit in a hurry. The prosecution uses in their brief also some elements in the insignia of various units in 1991 through 1995. I should like to remind Your Honours that the day before yesterday we had occasion to see a comparison between the scorpion insignia with the emblems used by the JATD. We can also see that in paragraphs 376 through 381 of the prosecution final brief. The prosecution insists on a fact that is notorious and commonplace, that the sword is used as a symbol. I believe all the parties in the proceedings agreed on this. Page 11145. Also, the 4 Cyrillic letters S can be found on almost all insignia, Serbian insignia and coat of arms. Emblems where the sword and the 4 letters S are together do not tell us anything about any connection between the scorpions and the SDG or any other unit. Quite simply, those emblems were ubiquitous. And these units were used by the local authorities to provide security at oil fields. That cannot be linked to the SDB of Serbia just because one of their units also had a sword and the 4 letters S on their insignia. The same applies to the emblems of the Serbian Volunteers Guard. These emblems and iconography were pervasive, and this argument cannot provide a basis for making any conclusions. For the reasons stated in our final brief, and as we tried to point out in our closing arguments, the prosecution has completely failed to prove any role of Franko Simatović in the implementation of the JCE in Croatia, either in the Knin Krajina or the area known as SBWS. With your leave, Your Honours, I would now give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Petrović, who would deal with the implementation of the JCE in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Mr. Petrović.
Dobar dan, časni sude. Hvala na...
Good afternoon, Your Honor. I thank you for this opportunity to address you at this last stage of the proceedings against our client, Mr. Franko Simatović.
Tužilac je u svom završnom...
In his final trial brief, the prosecutor suggested, and in his closing arguments explicitly stated, that Arkan and the Serbian Volunteers Guard went to Bijeljina and Zvornik in coordination with Simatović and the leadership of the Bosnian Serbs.
Smatra...
The defense believes that the prosecution has failed to provide any proof for such allegations. The way and the circumstances under which Arkan and the Serbian Volunteers Guard were involved in the events in Zvornik in Bijeljina have been described in detail in the defense final brief. From that we see who invited Arkan, we see who held meetings with him, with whose units he was in coordinated action, with which political structures he harmonized and agreed his activity. Simatović is nowhere to be found in there. Regarding Bijeljina, the defense should like to draw your attention particularly to exhibits D84 and P1621, from which we can clearly conclude that the meeting in Bijeljina with Arkan was attended by Fikret Abdić, Biljana Plavšić, JNA General Praščević, and JNA General Savo Janković, at that time commander of the JNA Tuzla Corps. At this meeting, there was nobody from the DB of Serbia. The defense particularly emphasizes the testimony of the witness whom we cited in our brief in the chapter concerning Arkan and the SDG in Zvornik, 1992. Defense witness Dimitrijević described in detail how Biljana Plavšić invited Arkan to Bijeljina, describes the cooperation between Arkan and the JNA during this operation. Transcript pages 16,347 through 16,349. That the testimony of witness Dimitrijević was truthful and authentic is also shown by the evidence provided by the prosecution witness JF 025, who confirmed before this trial chamber that there was a meeting between Biljana Plavšić and Arkan in Bijeljina. Transcript page 6285. Biljana Plavšić herself states in Exhibit D52 that she personally directed the events in Bijeljina. From this exhibit, we clearly see the relationship and the role of Arkan and Plavšić in these events. Nobody mentions Simatović, nor is he present at any meeting, agreement, or activity before, during, or after the fall of Bijeljina.
Deo svog brifa, časni sude, tužilac koji se odnosi na Zvornik.
The part of their brief that relates to Zvornik, the prosecution begins with the heading, "The accused have sent Marko Pavlović to Zvornik." Under that heading, however, there is nothing in the text that makes it clear how exactly the accused sent that person to Zvornik. It is said that Pavlović was a member of the DB. The cited source is the testimony of JF 026. But when we analyze that evidence, we do not find anything to confirm that Pavlović was a member of the state security. The only thing mentioned is the connection between Pavlović and Kostić. What exactly was the connection between Pavlović and Kostić is something we have no information about. We also have no information about any connection between Simatović and Kostić. So, although the prosecution suggests in the very heading that Simatović is somehow linked with Pavlović's arrival in Zvornik, when they try to substantiate it, they fail completely. At this point, and in many other places, the prosecution is simply trying to identify Simatović with one entire service. The defense have in their brief described in detail the position and the role of Simatović in the service. Any responsibility Simatović might bear can only be weighed in the context of his position in the service in which he worked at the relevant time. Now, Your Honours, could we briefly go into private session?
We move into private session.
Your Honours, we're back in open session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar.
Kada je grupa dobrovoljaca
When a group of volunteers of the Serbian Radical Party arrived by a JNA helicopter in the area of Batkusha village, JNA Colonel Nikolić decided to include these people into the 17th Tactical Group of the JNA. Colonel Nikolić is the one who issues orders to this group, as we can see from P1413. Nikolić orders this group also on the day of the killings in Crkvina. Colonel Nikolić issues orders also the day after the killings in Crkvina to the same group led by Lugar. The group that included Đorđević and Radovanović reports regularly on their activities to the command of the Eastern Bosnia Corps. We have in the case file as many as 5 documents showing that. However, there is absolutely no evidence that this group ever reported to the DB of Serbia. The evidence in the case file plainly shows that Đorđević was acting on the instructions he received from the command of the JNA Air Force. General Bajić is involved in bringing Đorđević to Šamac. General Bajić decides whether Đorđević should be sent back to Serbia. In December 1992, Mladić notes down Todorović's words that he knew Colonel Jeremić and General Bajić, and that it was with their mediation that he had sent men for training, and that they returned to the area of Šamac together with 30 volunteers from Kragujevac. We can see that in Exhibit P3117. Todorović, according to the Mladić diaries, never mentioned the DB of Serbia or Simatović. If Simatović had had any important role in these events, there would be no reason for Todorović not to mention it, and no reason for Mladić not to note it. The defense refers to our detailed arguments in paragraphs 1137 through 1213. There is a wealth of documents about these events and the players involved in the area of Šamac. The totality of these documents point to the unequivocal conclusion that the events in Šamac pursued a dynamic that Simatović had no influence over. And finally, even if it were true that Simatović was present when that group of 20 men was leaving by JNA helicopter to Šamac, the events in this town involved TO and JNA units with hundreds of fighting men, machinery, artillery, organization and logistics, which make the participation of 20 men symbolic and minor. That is the only participation that Simatović could have, if any, in these events. Minor, peripheral, and insignificant from the point of view of the course and outcome of these events. I'm looking at the clock, Your Honours. Perhaps it is time for the break.
Yes, could you tell us where you are approximately, Mr. Petrovic, in terms of time?
Časni sude, ja mislim...
Your Honours, I believe we will manage to conclude within the time granted us. If my math is correct, that would be between 30 and 35 minutes.
Yes. I agree with you, Matt. We take a break. Would it be wise to take the break 5 minutes shorter than usual, so that we are not ending up in either? I mean, the defense is the two defenses are the last to use the 1 hour left, and I think I would be hesitant to cut it short, or on the other hand, to rely on the voluntary cooperation of all those assisting us. They have children at home as well, which they may have to fetch. And so I suggest that we take exceptionally a 5-minute shorter break, and that will resume at 5 minutes to 4 o'clock. And that you would then finish, the Simatović defense would finish anywhere between 4:25 and 4:30. We take a break and we resume at 5 minutes to 4 o'clock.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.